and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today I wanted to look at one of the basic fundamental attributes that can be described about the sound we use in Debussy. There are very few universal ideas in music performance, ideas that can be applied to nearly every piece or every interpretation. Because of this, I have been hesitant in the past to ever label an idea as right or wrong. When we perform Debussy, there are certain elements of his compositional aesthetic that appear to point to a baseline quality of sound that can be applied to all of his pieces, with minor modifications depending on the musical and character situation. The intention of this episode is to identify this baseline and how we can achieve it. Let's consider Debussy's Rêverie. First off, the texture is very thin and transparent. The opening really has only two voices, and they're far enough apart that no matter what we do, we'll be able to hear everything. Even when he expands the gestures to higher and lower parts of the keyboard, Debussy is careful to maintain the illusion of transparency by writing according to the strengths of the piano. He never puts too many notes in the bass, and he rarely meets or crosses the voices. When we isolate the accompaniment, we can see that the bottom four notes of each chord are generally over an octave span. The top four notes are generally under an octave span. In total, we have a beautiful chord that resonates in a seemingly natural way. This is important to recognize, because composers such as Beethoven and Brahms tend to maintain the same density of notes at the top and bottom. Instead of Debussy's beautiful distribution here, the same chord in Beethoven might sound like this. Notice the slight growl in the sound? These choices in distribution roughly follow the harmonic series, which is why they tend to blend so well when played. In the most extreme case, Debussy uses the first three notes in the harmonic series in terms of distribution. The fundamental, the octave above it, and the fifth above that. We see it here. The first example that I played before of the accompaniment is actually the harmonic series minus the first octave below. If we put the octave underneath it, the chord continues to blend well, but now we have much more bass. This kind of distribution of notes, according to the harmonic series, is not an accident. In Debussy, it is one of the most common occurrences in terms of compositional style, and it actually helps us to determine how much pedal we can use. Let me explain. Debussy without pedal is like a fish without water. Most of his works are to be played with the assumption of using the damper pedal, unless the piece is very fast and has a high rate of harmonic change per beat. His keyboard distribution of notes accommodates and in some ways takes advantage of this assumption of pedal usage. Even if we overdo the pedal, the music is still clear. When I talk about the growl we can find in pieces of Beethoven and Brahms, it is actually a source of constant frustration for many pianists. How many times do we have to consciously thin out the bass of a piece by Brahms, or selectively voice a low four-note chord of Beethoven so that it doesn't overpower everything? In both of these cases, the composers were writing for a different kind of piano, one that had a transparent sounding bass, which could even be used for subtle counterpoint. Debussy was writing for a piano which is very similar to today's in terms of sound and register, and therefore it comes as no surprise that he distributes his notes in a way that is pleasing to the ear and seemingly automatic in terms of voice and control. There are other composers around the same time as Debussy who did this, and I think we need to consider one of them for a moment. Rachmaninoff used this kind of voicing on the piano, and it's a natural question that comes up as to why we would use a different sound quality for the Russian style of performance compared to the French. After all, both styles require lots of pedal, both use the same accompaniment distribution according to the harmonic series, and both have lots of rubato as well. Lots of similarities, in other words. Let's consider the opening of the second Etudes-Tableaux of Rachmaninoff from Opus 39. This piece, from a texture point of view, is very much like Debussy. On the surface, we could argue that the heavy sound we tend to use in Rachmaninoff should be suitable for Debussy. Or another way of putting it is to say, why should we have a different sound in Debussy to the sound we use in Rachmaninoff? We have a long melody line, like in the Debussy, have a continuous, yet clearly separated texture, open enough for copious amounts of pedal. But now we come to the difference. In a slow bar of 3 beats, Rachmaninoff changes the harmony slightly on each beat. This requires a slight change of pedal each time, as the change in harmony is accomplished by moving a single note 1 step away. If we held the pedal all the way through this change, we'd get a blur that interferes with the change. So, we have to change the pedal cleanly for each beat. What happens in a Debussy? For the first 6 bars, it's identical. After this, he changes the harmony only once or twice a bar, and given that it's common time, that's once or twice for every 4 beats. Compared with the Rachmaninoff, you have more notes per pedal change, or another way of putting it is that you have a less dense harmonic progression. There's more to it than this, of course. In the Rachmaninoff, the melodic voice requires a change of pedal to differentiate it from simply being a broken chord. If I leave the pedal, then we get the effect of the notes blending into each other to form a chord instead of a melody. With the Debussy, the melody can be played entirely in pedal, and the changes do not have to be as clear or swift. In fact, the opening 6 bars can be played in one pedal without a change. This is where we get to the second element of Debussy's sound, as opposed to others. Just to be clear, obviously these 2 pieces are entirely different, and written by composers who emphasize completely different aesthetic ideals. But I think it's important to compare them, because we get a sense of how subtle differences in relatively similar musical situations can make a huge difference. In many ways, Rachmaninoff asks us to treat each note of an arpeggio as a melodic element, or at least with the potential of it. In Debussy, he writes his arpeggios in such a way that they work both as melodic elements and simply broken chords. In other words, if we pedal through an arpeggio in Debussy, we don't lose anything. Whereas if we pedal through an arpeggio in Rachmaninoff, we definitely lose a communicative element. We're getting closer to the crux of this sound issue, but we're not quite there yet. Consider, the Rachmaninoff could be played using a Debussy-like sound and still work for a while. The Debussy would not be able to work at all if we used a Rachmaninoff sound. In other words, the sound that works well in Debussy is a sound that allows for ambiguity regarding what part of the struck note is important to the ear. Let me say that again. The sound that works well in Debussy is a sound that allows for ambiguity regarding what part of the struck note is important to the ear. What do I mean by this? There are three basic parts to the sound that we make on the piano. The first is the ictus, the initial hammer strike. It's the click of the sound at the beginning. The second part of the sound is what happens just after the click, where we can hear the quality of sound and a more stable pitch. The third part is a combination, really, the decay and the dampening. Some of these elements are exaggerated to some extent, and some are actively muted when we play the note in the damper pedal. Here's where things get a little more complex. When we have a melody that we want people to listen to, we usually have to exaggerate the first and second parts of the sound, the strike and the resonance. The strike commands the ear's attention to the sound, and then we listen to the resonance just after. The priorities, in terms of what we hear, are simply articulation and pitch, and we have to clear the pedal once in a while so that the articulation and pitch remain clear and regular. When we are playing accompaniments, we tend to do something different with the sound. We aim not to bring out the strike of the note, but we try to soften this strike, so that the resonance and decay are not shielded by it. This results in notes that have no easily identifiable beginning, and furthermore, the notes tend to blend very easily into one another. Our ears focus not on the individual notes, but on the conglomerate sound. When we consider the differences between the Debussy and the Rachmaninoff, this plays out in a very obvious way. In the Debussy, it's advantageous for nearly all the notes to blend. In the Rachmaninoff, it's advantageous for certain notes to blend and others to stand out. We're getting closer to the mark, but there's still a few more things to consider. Sound quality plays a huge role, and it is a very difficult beast to tame. when we have to use copious amounts of pedal. Normally, generation of a singing tone really comes down to softening the strike whilst extending the resonance of the note. That's really all it is. If we use the pedal, this happens automatically, though we still need to make an effort to soften the strike through our technique. Furthermore, the assumption when playing a singing line is to play it legato. Once again, this is something connected to the initial strike. If we play legato, then the strike of the next note is hopefully hidden or obscured by the resonance of the previous note played, which is why the first note of any line always seems to have an accent. But the technique of playing legato forces us to hold onto the note after we play it. No staccato allowed. When we do this in pedal, the sound may not resonate well, and in fact, it may sound pressed and constricted. This is where confusion begins, because the best way, in fact, to create a sound that resonates freely in pedal is to play it staccato. I'll show you what I mean. If we take our 5-note melody here and play it legato in pedal, here's what we get. Listen to how these notes blend, or not, with each other. Now, listen to the same notes played staccato in pedal. Can you hear a difference? A description could be that the staccato notes sound like there is more space or more air between them. We can differentiate the 5 different strands going at once. The legato notes start to conflict with each other after being played, in a way that is not very easy for us to discern the individual parts. Both sets of notes blend with each other and create a resonant space, but the legato resonance and the staccato resonance are both entirely different from each other. The staccato resonance allows for ambiguity, depending on our volume, of attention being paid to either the strike of the note or the resonance of the note blending with others. I'll play 1 or 2 of the notes louder, so you can hear them as prominent, and yet they'll still be blended nicely. When we do the same with the legato in pedal, the notes start prominently but do not remain so, with the resonance sounding clouded or hazy and not clear as a result of the buildup of sound. This deserves a little explanation. When we play legato in pedal, the resonance created after the strike decays in a very gradual manner, like a ramp that is not at a high angle. When we play staccato in pedal, there is a dip in the sound after the strike, and then the resonance picks up a little and then decays. The ramp has a pothole near the top. This difference is what accounts for our perception of a haze or a clear resonant space. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, using legato in pedal allows for us to create incredibly long melodic lines, which would not be possible without it. Chopin, Liszt, Brahms, and later Rachmaninoff and Scriabin are known for this. The front part of the note is what we hear and pay attention to. On the other hand, using staccato in pedal allows us to stratify many different lines at once, without losing the pitch of any of them. In other words, we can create a resonant space that continually changes without our ears being forced into listening to one particular singing line. We listen to the middle part of the note, the resonance that mingles and mixes with the larger resonant space. I mentioned earlier that with Debussy, it appears that the best sound is the one that allows for ambiguity regarding what part of the struck note is important to the ear. Playing staccato in pedal allows us to control this aspect. If we play legato in pedal, the front part obliterates the second part in the resonance field, as our ears cannot pick up the distinct notes that have already formed the resonance field. If we play staccato, then we form a resonance field that has distinct elements that are at once together and separate. In the Rachmaninoff, we need the long melody to be clearly differentiated from the accompaniment, with the harmony clearly differentiated at each change. Furthermore, he indicates certain notes to be held, which already pushes our approach in pedal towards the legato side of things. Sustenance is the key, not stratification, in other words. In the Debussy, we need an accompaniment that is constructed of close notes together to not blur or interfere with the melody, and we need a fast melody to be prominent and yet transparent so that, again, there is no interference in the sound, and each pitch is distinct in the pedal. Stratification is where we need to look towards. Playing anything truly legato here would crush the sound. The only solution would be to change the pedal more often, but this would lead to a broken sounding line and resonance field. See what I mean? There are subtleties that I have not touched upon in this episode regarding sound quality in Debussy. These must be left for another episode. The bottom line is that when we play in pedal, there are various degrees of dynamic and articulation change that we can create by having a detached approach. When we play legato in pedal, we can't do as much, and furthermore, the sound itself tends to have one type of coloration to it. But they both have their merits and uses, depending on the musical situation. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and when you approach Debussy, remember to seriously listen to the second part of the note, and not just the first. Bye for now.